Hello everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to WHIMS, and today I'm going to give you my review for the episode The Curse of the Ninth, which is the 5th episode of Series 9 of Inside Number 9. And this episode basically follows the classical superstition by a lot of classical composers that when a composer is reaching their 9th symphony, they will either die in the middle of writing said symphony, or they will shortly perish after the completion of their 9th symphony. And this particular episode follows the character of Mr Quiggley, who is played by Reece Shearsmith, who is basically visiting a mansion, a large manor house that was recently the occupant of a classical composer whose widow has basically assigned him to retune or sort of reconfigure an old piano. And this sort of leads him down into a rabbit hole where he becomes overly obsessed with this classical composer's final symphony, and it leads him down the rabbit hole of The Curse of the Ninth, which is essentially that old superstition. And what's really fascinating about this episode, and what I thought was really interesting and really intelligently done from the word go, was that this episode is a wonderful critique on creativity. And in many cases, a lot of people say, well, Inside Number 9 and Reece Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton tackling the idea of creativity isn't anything new on the world of Inside Number 9, or indeed the world of Reece Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton in general, because in the League of Gentlemen Apocalypse film, the idea of creators or the created having to come out of their fictional world and track down their creators in order to convince them to save them from this apocalypse is an interesting idea, and that's something that was tapped into. And of course, all these other years later, we've always had various different inputs on the creative output and what it does to various different people. In the case of the season 6 episode, Simon Says, we see it from the point of view of an obsessed fan basically harassing the creator and having something over said creator so that they can make sure that the final series that led to much disappointment from the fan base of the Ninth Circle end up finishing the series in a way that's satisfactory to long-term fans. But that's just an impossibility, and of course that entire episode was intelligently written in that regard, because it tells you that relationship between what happens between creators and fans, and how there is often a disconnect between the two. And in both cases, those two people are both horrible people. They both don't deserve the positions that they're in, but for some strange reason we are following these characters through this labyrinth of insanity, and it really does work for both comedic and dramatic effect, and even in terms of suspense as well, because there is a lot of suspense in that episode. And we have another episode in Series 7 where the creative output is treated as a rug pull by the main character of Cat. Nine Loves Cat essentially follows a detective who is trying to solve the case of an abducted child. But spoiler alert, halfway through the episode we find out that the character is a fictional construct, a character that's been created by an author played by Steve Pemberton, who, after visiting and revisiting Cat multiple times, he decides to pretty much throw her in the bottom drawer. And whenever he gets the character out of the bottom drawer and examines the story that he's written, it's always the same way. She wakes up in a darkened room and she goes and has Cocoa Pops with vodka. And that's effectively what that entire story is. It's basically telling that creative output, the output of writer's block, effectively, from the point of view of a character and treating the character as a sentient being. And that's effectively a very interesting concept that's very well thought out. And of course, there's a lot of good performances in that episode. But in the case of Curse of the Ninth, this episode does talk about creativity, but it talks about creativity in a very interesting way, which is they use the idea of the Curse of the Ninth as a way of effectively talking about what happens when you have reached your peak as a writer and as a creative. Except in the case of most creatives are either novelists these days, or poets, or playwrights, or television writers, or directors. there's not many composers around, or classical composers around, so not many people probably will relate to this. But I think even if you're in music, you probably do get some element of what it's like to create a track, or what goes into creating a score or creating a mix. It's very similar in that regard, except instead of using those machines where you turn the dials up and down and you turn, nozzles or what have you, and you hear those beatboxing themes and things like that, you're basically hearing the scratches of an inkwell and pen effectively, and that's what's essentially happening here. And this episode was very intelligently written. Sorry, I have an itchy foot. Yes, I really did enjoy this episode. I thought it was very funny. I thought at the beginning the carry-on style innuendos, like when Steve Pemberton runs his fingers through the piano and he goes, "Oh, this piano's beautiful, isn't she? Hasn't been fingered in a while," and things like that. Like little nods like that are really distracting, but then you realise that because this is a really dark story, there needs to be comedy and there needs to be a little bit of levity. So the carry-on style innuendos is pretty much welcome with where this episode goes. But that's not the only calibre of humour that they have. Like, there's this wonderful running joke where Reece Shearsmith's character keeps getting the name of the maid wrong. Her name's called Mrs Davonshire, and he keeps calling her Mrs Davenport or Mrs Kent and things like that. Like, Mrs Davonshire is a very simple name to remember, but for some strange reason he keeps forgetting the name, and there is probably a bit of snobbery in that regard, in regards to how he views himself and how he sort of views other people in the household. He probably sees himself on the same footing as the lady of the house, Natalie Dormer's character, as opposed to the actual help, which he actually is in the same league as the maid. So I thought that was actually very interesting. But this episode is actually very fascinating because in the case of Reece Shearsmith's character, he is a person who is someone who really admires this composer, who he finds himself in the unexpected company of, and he does take great delight in wanting to finish the Ninth Symphony, but he is very superstitious because he thinks, oh my god, if I do complete this, or if I'm in the middle of completing this, will I succumb to this strange omen? And he does have that sort of conflict throughout. But what's very interesting about this this story is there is a bit of a narrative about what happens to creativity once the well of your successes is spent. It's kind of like, it's almost like a little bit of a meta Inside Number 9 episode in that respect, because many people will probably be thinking after this, well, what's going to happen now? What are we Inside Number 9 fans going to do once this series has ended? Well, it's simple. We'll find something else. And that's not even just something that creatives have to deal with. The fans deal with it as well. We're constantly thinking to ourselves, what are we going to do after this show's finished? Well, I'm certainly going to be making more videos of all sorts of different things that I enjoy, but I will be returning to Inside Number 9, so I'm not completely done with it yet, but I do feel like in terms of this new batch of new, fresh episodes, this is pretty much where the stop ends, and I feel like that's what is at the heart of most of these things. But most people have that. Like my cousin James, he had a love of and he still does, he still loves Avatar: The Last Airbender, but he famously said to me, well, I say famously, I'm talking about him as if he's famous, but he isn't. He is he isn't famous, but he is. He did say to me once that he felt lost after he watched the series of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I feel like that's something that happens to all of us. We do feel kind of lost, or we feel like we're kind of thinking to ourselves, well, where will we go once this show ends? And that's kind of the same thing for creatives. Like they always probably wonder themselves, like, how am I going to top this, or how am I going to wrap this up, and what am I going to do once it's over? And it's one of those things that really is quite interesting, because I'm pretty sure J.K. Rowling, when she wrote the Harry Potter series, she was probably thinking to herself, well, what am I going to do now? Or what am I going to do now once it's done? But then she came out with the Casual Vacancy, and that was met very welcomingly, even though not many people liked it, but I certainly wasn't one of them. I really did like it. But then she had a bit of a quiet period where nothing really happened, and then of course the Cormoran Strike series came out of nowhere, which we didn't know was actually written by her until it was revealed some months later. And that is something that just genuinely happens, is we do kind of find ourselves wondering what are they going to do next, and I am excited for what they're going to do next, but then we just don't know. And what I really like about this episode is that Mr Quiggley is no saint. Mr Quiggley is, again, he's a snob in the way he reviews his relationship between Mrs Devonshire and the lady of the house, in this particular story, the Natalie Dormer character, who's this widow of this classical composer. He reviews himself pretty much on the same level as the lady of the house, where he just kind of thinks to himself, well, I'm very much posh, and I'm very much, in tune with being with these people. Whereas when I'm with the maid, she literally just tells him point blank, Mrs Devonshire, she says, you are literally the same as me. You are literally the help. You're no one else. You're no one special. But when he looks at her, it's pretty much established in the way he sort of has her name said to him. I feel like that's something that's really interesting, because when he gets her name wrong, it's something that really is at the heart of who he is, that he keeps getting his name wrong. It could be just a simple mistake, but I feel like he doesn't see himself in the same league as her. He sees himself as a bit of a snob. So that's why when she reveals that she, when they get the Ninth Symphony out from the composer's dead grasp out of his grave, she literally says, someone will fetch a fair price for this particular symphony, this uncompleted symphony. And it's like, going, no, we shouldn't do that. We should want to share this piece of music with the world, this piece of art with the world. We want to inspire joy from people. So when she says, no, I'm not going to do that, I want to get fed, I want to earn some money, I want to become rich and wealthy, and then he just ends up killing her with a shovel because he thinks she's a terrible person. But in many ways, he's no saint either. He actually just killed someone. But it's actually quite interesting, because it turns out that he is the most pure of intent in this episode. Even though technically he is still a monster in the sense that he's killed someone, he still has the most pure motive in regards to what he intends to do with this piece of creativity, this piece of art. And I thought that was actually a very interesting twist, because it turns out that Natalie Dormer's character, she's a widow and she's practically destitute. She's living in this house and she's got a lot of wealth, but she is pretty much broke, and she tries to pretty much use this character, this quote-unquote innocent person, to try to finish the symphony, because she knows that he has a fascination with classical music and composing, and he's even admitted that he's composed once or twice. But there is something about this that does make me kind of think to myself, okay, she's a horrible person, but is he any better? And it really does give you this impression that there is something. Even if he didn't kill the maid, I think we still would be looking at him and thinking to ourselves, you're no saint, mate, and we know what your number is, we know who you are, and that's the type of dynamic that you get. But what I think is very interesting is that it is about creativity, and what we often do when we find ourselves in these difficult situations where we do find something coming to an end, and what we often find ourselves considering, the creative has this idea of what am I going to do next, and of course we're often asking ourselves the question, what are we going to do when this is all over? And in many cases, you'll always find something to do when this is all over, because the world keeps on turning and we keep on living, and that's effectively what happens. And what's the point in this is to actually just say that you will always find something. Like when I'm finished writing Angel Dust, I'm going to go back to writing some poems and some short stories. And when Angel Dust is finished, I will be going back for a second outing with that character, but I do feel like once the 10 chapters that I plan to release for that series is over, it's pretty much going to be me alone with this particular story for a while. But I do want to know, do you guys want to see more of that? Because I do feel like I have more ideas for that character and more ideas for Simon and his entire cast of characters, his family and what have you. I have other stories in the works for that particular idea, but we're only halfway through as of this recording. So to me, I feel like there's tons of different ways in which you can look at this particular episode, but I do think it's a fun episode. It's a great examination of what superstition has in terms of a role in influencing the creator and their creation. But there's also just some really good lines of dialogue, like, say, for example, the line where Mr Quiggley is writing the symphonies and he's constantly being taunted by the ghost of the old composer. He says, well, there's only one place you're going to go when that symphony is finished, and you're going to be food for the ever-conquering worm. And that's actually quite a very good line. I actually really do like dialogue like that, and it really does feel like it has a richness to it that really is quite, it's almost musical in its own way. It actually is really quite interesting. and there's almost like a rhythm, like a poetic rhythm to the way that line was uttered, and I really do like that. I really do like that there's almost like a rhythm in the way this composer speaks, and there's so many interesting elements like that. But I really do like what this episode says about creativity. I thought it was a very funny episode, but it really did have a good atmosphere as well. And that's pretty much my review for the Ninth Circle, the Curse of the Night, excuse me. Let me know what you guys thought of this episode in the comments. Did you like it? Did you think it could have done a lot more? Do you think it had great characters? Do you think it had good writing? What did you think of this episode? I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And if you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and leave a like and a comment, and please be sure to subscribe for more videos. I hope you're all doing very well. This has been Josh from Whimsical and Interesting Musings. Take care. Bye for now.